setting implies not only geographical location, but also the era and body from which a story is told. With that in mind, how much does the setting what other aspects of setting do you incorporate to make your work more effective? Let's start with James, because you're next to me.
This is great. I can look over her shoulder and see the answers. Oh,
the answer is all of them.
The answer is all of them. It is. My books are set in the high desert of Utah. And it's important that it's a desert. It's important that there is a quality of light in the Utah desert. Terry Tempest Williams has written about it. And when the action or the dialogue takes place in a particular setting, it goes to atmosphere, it goes to tone, and you find that it colors how people perceive what's actually happening. I can't imagine not being intensely aware of a setting, a sense of place. And setting and sense of place are actually, I think, a little bit different.
Yeah, my books, my two books that have been published have both been set in my hometown of Melbourne. And yeah, while you were speaking, James, I realised that my work is quite dialogue heavy, and I realise that also plays a big part in setting the scene. The way you know how the characters have been shaped by where they live, what they say, how they interact. Melbourne's quite a foodie design city, and that is reflected, I guess, I have artistic creative characters. So in that sense, the place is within the characters and their relationships to one another, yeah. Mm.
Thank you. I believe poetry is not a language. That's why to explain, to speak about poetry always, I find it very difficult. My poetry speaks from a place, from the beginning. When I first published my first book, it got 2 prizes. One of the critic, he was trying to find out a link, a root, which my poetry comes from, a master poet or some other traditions. And he said, I couldn't find it. Could you please tell me where this language, a new Turkish, coming from? That time my answer to that question was, the place I grow up. But the meaning of place here, it's not a certain geographical, physical place to me. It's also spiritual. And that's why usually I write when I am on the roads, walking on a journey, when I am on the flow, not feeling the limitation of the geography. But in my mind, in my soul, always I feel a kind of certain connection to a meaning, which was described by Lorca very well. He says, duende. I think we poets or writers, we create our own connection with the earth and universe. And through this movement or this magnetic field, you create your language. This is what I can say for now. Okay.
Thank you. Sarah, should I talk about my own work?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Ali Imam Manasto Manam Ghulam Ali. Thank you. You know, I learned my early lesson from Derek Walcott. The same question was put to him, and he replied that the work should be local, and then it could be universal. You know, place is very important. It provides both the form as well as the content to your work. You can do a lot of reading. in order to understand the form, various forms of craft. But from where does the inspiration comes? Which triggers you to write? Ultimately, it has to be the place. It is the place, the setting, where you set your story, where you set your play. Your language comes from and your story comes from. In my own plays, for example, in the last metaphor, there is this image of crow, which is often sitting on the electric cable and mocking the inhumanity of the people. From where does the crow come? It comes from the everyday life around me. When you go across the cities in Pakistan, you often find crows sitting on the electric cables. So that crow, people talk about the metaphorical aspect of the crow. I say, thank you. But I take its crow as a vantage point from where you are looking down at the action. And when I talk about the violence, which violence I'm talking about, by the way? I'm talking about the violence which happens in the street outside my home. The kind of violence which happens on the roads, I'm talking about that violence. And if I'm talking about the death, for example, in my another play, The Breath, from where that experience of death comes. Whenever someone dies, people gather in streets. People gather to condole the family. And suddenly you find that there are a lot of people with serious faces, they gather in street. And the whole play begins from there. And in my play, Odyssey, my Odysseus, he is also Pakistani. He's a Pakistani soldier returning from war on terror. So again, when I indigenize Odyssey, whether I'm writing about death, where I'm talking about friendship, I'm talking about violence, or I'm talking about human degradation, I'm talking about mob violence, where does it come from? It comes from my own land. So I think it is the land primarily which is really the source of form as well as the source of content.
Yes, I would also like to talk about place rather than setting. I'm from Iceland, a small island in the North Atlantic. And when you're born on an island, you are quite aware of the place you are born in, because it is separate from the rest of the world. It is isolated by the mighty ocean. And all stories that take place there are marked by the geographical situation. When you live on an island, you have quite a strong view, a clear view maybe on the material at hand. So when you're writing stories, novels, the relatively small place you're dealing with has a quite well-defined set of characters. The social structures are quite clear to you in the small setting. And most stories are about trying to escape the island, strangers coming to the island, one of the islanders going crazy and trying to change things on the island before being expelled from the island, maybe. So we have a quite clear set of narrative structures which come from the fact that we are in a place that is defined by its geographical situation. But when you're on an island, the ocean can be seen as a wall, or it can be seen as a road. And if you are of a people who came to the island at a certain point in history, you will never forget that it is a road. So you don't feel isolated in the sense that you know that if you can gather enough bric-a-brac wood, you can tie it together, you might be able to float away. So I'm keenly aware of place as the beginning of story and what defines the story. The difference between my island and Derek Walcott's island is that his island has all the features of a paradise. It's warm, it produces fruit, it shelters animals, while my island is very hostile. The biggest land mammal in Iceland is the fox. It was there when man came, and it was not happy. The second largest mammal, native land mammal in Iceland is the field mouse. So you can see that human beings cannot feed on those two animals except in absolute desperation. But the difference between my island and Derek Walcott's island is that his island has all the nature of a paradise, but a history of violence and the slave trade and all that came with it. While we live on a very hostile lava ground, but in relative peace with nothing.
You guys are really good at this. Each of you in your work, you deal with travel in some way. I'm wondering if you think that, or how you feel maybe, a change of scenery affects your story, if it's necessarily emblematic of internal structure or changes for the character, or if it's maybe just a catalyst for change. James, your protagonist is a truck driver. Sunni, your characters all travel. Bejan, you've called yourself a nomad. So you literally are moving while you're writing. Usman, your characters are travelers as well. And Sjon, I know that you deal with different place, maybe outside the accepted reality. So how is change in place? This is for everyone. How does it affect your structure or your story? Bejan, you look ready.
Never ready. As I said, usually I write when I walk, when I'm on the road, on a journey. Maybe this nomadic DNA from my ancestors, this nomad DNA I had. This is the reason. I think our metaphors or images or the image we create in poetry, some say subconscious, some say unconscious. We have this reservoir, this potential imagery, let's say. This we carry with us wherever we go. Some of my poetry I write where I wrote. I say like Rabat or Scotland or maybe in America soon, I don't know. Most of my poetry I wrote not in the place I born. Some people ask me why you use the location. You say you wrote this in Ireland or in Rabat. If the place has a meaning and adds something in the poetry for the readers, then I mention the name. If not, I just leave it. Because all my poetry, most of them I wrote when I was flying on the airplane. I remember one, I visited Doha Islamic Art Museum. There was a project by Qatar and Bloomsbury Foundation. The book was, they invited some poets, philosophers like Eric Hobsbawm, Zizek. Anyway, they called from Turkey, they called me, and they want me to visit the museum and then choose a piece and write something on that piece. That time, I chose one of the object like astrolabe from 9th century by El-Hijabi. I was amazed when I see the astrolabe. I felt like I'm in 9th century, and I was like El-Hijabi, feeling like him the moment that he was carving his astrolabe. Anyway, with all these feelings and inspiration, when I take the flight back to Istanbul, I had 4.5 hours. In the plane, I wrote 25 chapters. And I finished. It was not edited, really. It was ready. This is how it happened. Of course, we had the inspiration from a certain location, certain images. We collect them. But these are only you use as a trigger. It triggers something inside you. You had this already. Yeah.
Yes, I'd use the word trigger as well for me. I think travel, I never really think about how, I never travel looking for inspiration, but it's usually once you've travelled and the flavour of the place is mellowed, then you're sort of left with that richness that is often becomes inspiration. Yeah, and I think in terms of the actual narrative, for me, it often, in answering your question, it often serves to, change the pace, or it does symbolise it's a shift in something that's happening with the character in terms of the main setting changing to a travel location or somewhere new. That often serves for me to sort of be a change in pace or a shift in something that's happening for the character. Yeah.
If nobody else is excited about this question, we can move on.
My characters travel very little. They desire to go other places, but they are very much stuck in Iceland. So when they travel through books or films they see or stories they hear from faraway places. So whenever a character in my book thinks of another place, that is the journey he or she can make. And they do.
And I can just add to this comment. I have never traveled before in my life. Yet, I sense that my characters have been making journeys. So perhaps after a year or two, Sarah, I could be able to answer this question better. When I intend to write the plays which are inspired by Iowa, like elevators, like garbage, like Becky, like In the Name of Dada, when I write those plays, perhaps then I would be able to answer your question, I think.
I think it was a very good question. And I particularly liked, I can't pronounce.
Bejan?
Bejan? What she said about the spiritual. I am a novelist, I'm a fiction writer, but my process is much more like a poet. I'm working from image. And when I think about all the things that everyone has said here, I think about how when we travel, our perspective changes. And by travel, I mean one step forward, one step back. And again, it triggers something in us, and that can be a flashback, or in the desert, for instance, something that my protagonist has seen every day for 20 years. Every day he sees it differently. The light is a little bit different, he's going a little slower, he's going a little faster. It has to do with what just happened, what might happen. I think all of those things, there's an inner sense of place, of setting, and when we move, that begins to be set in motion and can change the entire narrative of the book.
So as your character grows, his sense of the place around him changes.
Yes.
And what do you find so compelling about the desert?
What I find so compelling is what most people find so distressing, which is there's nothing there. I think of the desert as it brings what really matters into high relief. And what does really matter? Water, human connection. All these things are so much more visible than if you're someplace where there are all kinds of natural resources and lots of people. So I like to tell small stories against a huge empty landscape. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was awesome. And it leads back to Sjon, I think, how you and Usman, I think, sounded like you were particularly affected by the place in which you were raised, in the way that you tell stories and the location and way that your characters interact with the location that they're in. Would you maybe have a response for the starkness, the lack of resources that James brought up, or more insight to why the place you were raised has had such effect?
Well, I think we are all born into a small world. And as we grow up, we discover that even though we were born into a small world, that definitely was the center of the universe the moment we were born, that there is something else out there. But I think most great literature is rooted in a specific place, in a specific community, and it is small. And because it is small, like I said earlier about the islands, your opportunities are limited. It's a place of want. There is need in the small place, because a small place doesn't have everything. So you are dealing with what you've got, both in the real life, and that, of course, informs the material you have to work with as a writer. And I think the stories from the small world are really the only stories that have the possibility of becoming universal, to answer that part of the motivation for our panel here. And why is that? That is because even though we grow up in wildly different cultural environments, and we are born into different social structures, we're born into different places within those social structures, there are certain things we all go through. And I think we find special joy in hearing, reading, watching stories from faraway places. And why is it? It's because we like to watch people do the exactly same things we do, but differently. So that is why the place is important, and that's why it's important to be true to the place and to bring that place to people in the faraway places, like with the desert. You will bring the desert to me. I will bring the black beach of the south coast of Iceland to you.
I always feel that I would use the phrase to plug into. You need to plug into your own light. And by light, I mean the experience of your own land. I'm very much rooted in my own land, and Sarah and with everyone. I lived around 20 years, in my own small city. And I never went out, and I was always uncomfortable whenever I went out. And people say that traveling is important for writing. Well, in my case, I seem to be dispelling the myth. I don't think even that is the final comment you can make on the writing process. You can be static, yet you can create traveling characters, yet you can create interesting journeys. So you cannot really say that traveling is essential. Many people have been saying to me that you must travel. But whenever I traveled, I couldn't find inspiration. So I plugged into my own land. And when this question also reminds me of Seamus Heaney. There's a beautiful poem by Seamus Heaney called A Churning Day. In that churning day, he talks about his mother who extracts butter from milk. And he describes how the perspiration comes out of her mother, how it is very much a physical and creative process. And then he talks about, in a poem called Thatcher, there was a worker who used to come in his village, who used to make roofs with straws. And then he talks about, there's a poem called Forge. He talks about the blacksmith, the way he molds the iron, the way he creates shapes. And then he looks at his own father. His father was a farmer. The way he grows, the way he sows the land, the way he makes lines in the fields. And in one of the beautiful poems, Digging, he says, I will dig with a pen. I will dig with a pen. So how physical activities of ordinary people in his own land can become a metaphors of the creative activity. So in my own case, when I look around, whether it is the small artists, who are working, whether the people who come to weave the cot in my home, yes, a lot of weavers you find in your own land, and a lot of people who are in fact workers, but I think whatever they're doing, and in particular the perspiration which comes out, the kind of focus all these people have, I think that really, energizes you to create a new form and a new shape, I think.
Sunny, do you have anything particularly compelling about Melbourne that keeps you writing characters in that place?
I think familiarity was just a natural first place where my inspiration came from. But my third book that I'm writing now is actually set in the States. So I am adventuring out. I've sort of travelled here quite a bit in the past 6 years, and I have been really inspired by, I guess, just some things that I wanted to explore, but that it wasn't actually possible to explore things about those, the character that I wanted to create wouldn't have worked in Melbourne. But she's going to be a large-scale sculptor who does large-scale works. And the history of art in Melbourne is nothing like New York. And the space in the Midwest, where there will also be part of the story set, we also don't have that kind of space in Australia. So large-scale artwork with history is very well suited to Soho in New York, not so much to Melbourne. So I love Melbourne. I'm sure I'll return there, but at the moment the character and her needs are driving me at the moment.
So I'll do one more question for Bejan and Sunny, and we can open it up to all of you if you guys have questions. Otherwise, I'll keep going forever. Displacement? How does displacement affect your writing? I'll start with Bejan.
As I say, we carry our physical being and our subconscious with us to everywhere. And our connection with the world or earth, it's very crucial in that to be a creative writer or a poet. To me, I always think about, because I'm bilingual, I born in a Kurdish family. My first language is Kurdish, and I was educated in Turkish, and I write in Turkish. Now I went back to Kurdish also. I'm preparing my first Kurdish book, poetry book. I always think about the mother language, mother tongue. What is the difference of mother tongue from the other language? To me, mother language, mother tongue is your childhood scenery, what you remember from your childhood. It has the colors, it has the sounds, it has the smell. It's more like a womb. It holds you. It holds your spirit. And through that, you create your metaphors, imagery, all this, as I said earlier. In that, as we are a moving human being or creature, we move from a place to other place. We have journeys, we took journeys, we carry ourselves through this journey. To me, the most important thing in this journey, the sincerity of the writer or the poet. When we see other stories, other realities, or the sorrow that life created in every part of the world, our connection with these new stories, which we were not familiar before, we need to be very sincere. With my poor English, I'm trying to explain better, but for example, if I'm visiting Africa and there are political problems or an apocalyptic scene, you see something, writing about this very quickly, it can be very cheap sometimes. It can be very like propaganda language, you know. It's easy to create this effect on the readers. I'm very careful about not being that quickly picking the other stories. There is my story always. There is a filter, which is my reality, my spiritual field, as I said. I filter the reality I face, I saw, and then it become mine. Then it's sincere. Chagall has a very nice line. He says, "We all speak about the room that we were born in." As you said, it's a room. What we are trying to write or describe or speak, this room gives us this courage to continue or the energy to continue. And as I said, mother tongue, even if you left behind, those sounds, those colors, everything is following you. And through that, you are trying to create your connection with the life and continue. Yeah.
Could you ask the question again?
I forgot the question. I never understand questions anyway.
Good answers anyway.
I was going to say that. How does a sense of displacement propel your narrative? I forgot the question too. Yeah. Something about displacement.
I'm not sure I deal with displacement in my work, but while, I was thinking that I think feeling displaced, I think feeling comfortable as a writer is quite important. I think exploring other spaces is important, or at least has influenced me, but I think feeling comfortable and settled is a very important, for me at least, starting point to creation. I think being creative is actually quite a privilege, and a privilege thing to be able to do, and to have those basic needs met and to feel comfortable, and to have your place while you're writing, I think is really important. So to feel settled and like you're in your space is, I think it'd be hard to feel displaced and lost and write at the same time. So in that sense, I feel like, for me at least, I need that. Yeah.
Okay, does anybody in the audience have any questions? We've got a mic up here, or you can yell really loud. Yeah?
Since a number of the writers here have been translated. I wonder if you've encountered with your translators any issues about translating either language that comes from a particular place or images or particularities of place. Has that come across in any of your work with translators?
This sounds like a Bejan question.
I didn't get the question.
What conflicts have you had in translation with
With my translation.
with wrestling?
Issues with when particular things where translators have had lots of questions for you. Like, how do I convey this? Or can you explain more about this aspect of the language or the place?
This morning I met my translator here. we worked 2 hours in my new book. Some people believe poetry cannot be translated because poetry is music. To me, it's a music, and you cannot create same sound in another language. That's why you have to find someone who has a very strong sense of poetry. That's why I'm very careful to choose the translator, and I'm also very patient. Many people tried, but I tried to find the best one or someone who is close to my depth, let's say, my soul's depth. It helps. There are many, questions and contradictions also. I fight a lot with them, with my poor English. Sometimes, once in England, my translator used a word called look. I said, this is not look, I mean gaze. She says, you don't speak English, how do you know gaze? Such a beautiful word, how do you know that? I said, I feel it, because poetry is about these feelings. And even though my grammar is not good, my English is not very poor, but still I see the depth of the language and I know what is wrong. And yeah.
Sjon, did you have an answer for that?
Yeah, in prose it's different. I think in poetry you cannot add explanations into the text. I am completely against footnotes. I don't like footnotes in my books, you know. I would rather that something was a little bit obscure or strange to the reader than explain it in a footnote. In some cases, I agree if the translator suggests that we put in like a little helpful explanation as a side note, or like, you know, or we weave it into the sentence. So if I mention a certain character, and let's say it's a story that takes place in the late 19th century when the Danish were not very popular in Iceland, I might mention a character, and every Icelander would realize, okay, this was the this was the governor that nobody liked, you know. But an English reader would, of course, not know that person or anything about the situation. So I might like allow that we put into the sentence, old man Christian, that bastard Dane, you know. So we would know, okay, it's somebody from the outside who has a rather poor reputation. But in general, I prefer to leave the things as they are. And as a reader of translated fiction, I, of course, encounter things like that. So I'm reading a Moroccan novel at the moment called The Hospital. And there are many things there, cultural references and things which are not obvious to me. But I just trust that, you know, that I'm in the good hands of the writer, and that the writer will slowly bring me into this world, and I will learn the nature of this world as I progress through the novel. Some things I will never understand. But this also happens with books from past times, you know. I mean, I'm sure if you're reading American novels from the 19th century, there's a lot of references there which are lost to the modern day reader. But you just continue if the story is good.
You had a question?
Yeah, if I might go from the sublime to the mundane, and give a little different twist to place. I'd like to know, what place do you write? And I'd like to ask each of you, do you have a specific place where you write in? You said you like to write on airplanes. I'm just curious, I'm just interested in the creative process. Do you have a place where you go to write? Do you have, do you have to have certain pencils? How is the creative process in terms of your particular place fit in?
I'm going to jump in here because James Lee Burke, who I don't know if any of you know his work, you should, but James Lee Burke worked a lot of years, and he always wanted to have a study with books and a nice chair and a desk. He wanted all those things. And I was watching an interview. He is from Louisiana, and most of his writing centers in the South, but he lives in Montana now. And they built a house there, and in that house where the interview is taking place is in that room he always wanted, with the table and the books and the little banker's light and so on. And he says, I've always wanted a room like this to write in. And he said, and I've had it for 10 years, and the only damn thing I've done is this interview. So, I can't write about the desert when I'm in the desert. I have to be in Oregon with all this verdancy and tall trees. So some people really need that, and I find that I can write anywhere when I need to write, but when I don't, it doesn't make any difference whether we're in beautiful rooms like this or libraries, but perhaps the others feel differently.
I feel I need that space to trigger that it's writing time for me. Like, I like routine, and when I go into that space, I know I'm not the kind of person to jot down. I occasionally jot down ideas on the go, but a lot of my writing is stream of consciousness, so I'll sit down and it's time. And that's time when I'm in that space, which is my office. But I agree that I prefer to be away from what I'm writing about when I'm writing about it. The inspiration comes when I'm in that sad, lonely room. And so I like the one space that I've cultivated for writing, and when I'm there, I know it's time to do the work.
I think there was a misunderstanding. I don't like planes. Writing is the only way I can stand on planes. I run into my caves inside me, and then this is the only way I can feel my being. That's why I write a lot when I travel, when I fly. Usually, as I said, my first writing, I write by hand, is when I walk or when I am on journey. But editing process is completely different. I need a desk and a room. I become like a German engineer. I'm very disciplined and very cruel towards my notes. I carve, and then I'm like a sculptor. I carve and throw it away. I don't add usually.
Well, for inspiration, I'm answering this question for the second time in Iowa City. First is inspiration. I don't need to wait for inspiration. I remain inspired all the time, And second thing is, when I am away from my small room, it is not a beautiful room, it's a very ordinary room. When I am away from that room, I can have one-liners, I can have ideas, but I cannot really push the story. For me, it is important to be in a desert to write about a desert. For me, it is important to remain in that room where I lived for 20 years in order to write. I feel I use a standing desk. I don't write by sitting at a table. And it is interesting, I have some skipping rope also. I do some physical exercises. I often skip rope also because I want to perspire before I want to actually plug into the page. I have a small football also. And I have certainly the warm cup of coffee, and I do this in hot summer. It is not about the cold winter. In my country, around 10 years, you have a very hot summer. So until or unless I perspire, as I was talking about Haney, that physical activity, that writing is very much a physical activity. I don't take it that it is something that you are sitting aloof and you are writing and nothing is happening to you. In my case, writing is very much a visceral and a very physical activity. Until or unless I perspire, I need to get out of my skin perhaps. So then I do. And when I begin to cold, I stop writing. With me, to be in that room and to have that physical activity are essential in order to create something on a page. That is why I think in my work, there are a lot of non-verbal movements. There are less words. It is very much a gestural theater. I draw less on language, on words. It is more on the non-verbal, because I write drama, and in drama, what is happening to the character on stage is more important than the imagination or than what is unseen on stage. So because it is about action, so I think it is very much ritualistic also. So I myself have to go through the same ritual, I feel. And I think, I also suffer with my characters. I don't have that objective relation with my characters. If my characters suffer, I do suffer with them. I share with them their suffering. So with me, I think that is how it works.
I do most of my writing in a small house on the south coast of Iceland. There's a village there of 500 people. It's a seaman's cottage from the beginning of the 20th century. And I like to go there because I need to leave the big city of Reykjavik to find the piece to write. There are 150,000 people in Reykjavik, so it is very busy to be there and distracting. So I go to this little fisherman's hut that we've had now for 18 years, and it has 3 small rooms. The living room is completely white, and I sit there and write. There is nothing to distract me. There is no television. There is a radio. No internet. I have a small mobile with that you can only use like a telephone. You can only speak to people through it. So I sit there and I listen to good music. I listen to Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer, particular piece. And that's where things start floating up from wherever, and they become visible to me, and I can put them into words. So that's how I write. And I write sitting down. It is hard work to sit. You have to be physically fit to be able to sit for hours and hours. So yeah, it's really a physical job. To be a writer. And sometimes you have to walk around a little bit to stretch and to loosen up the limbs, just so you can sit down again. But it can also be dangerous to get up from your seat when you're writing. So you should be careful about that.
From now on, when I read your works, I can picture where you are. Thank you.
We had a person in the back, and we can either do 1 or 2 more questions. But way back there.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, it seemed like there was a difference in terms of how you related to place. There was one set of answers that looked at place as an absolute, like the desert, or in terms of language, where there was just an absolute relationship with it. And the others talked more about place as universal, where all the stories could come and cross through, and anybody could identify with that. Is that an accurate reflection of what it is to write about a place? Are those 2 options that you think through as you're writing?
Is that for everyone?
Sure, yeah.
I just want to say that I think it is the same thing. I think a story from a definite physical place which is a small place. We can only live in small places. And the small places have their particular culture and rules and relationships. And like I said earlier, we like to read about people in faraway places doing the same things that we do, but differently. That's how a story becomes universal. That's why there is a funeral scene in every great film. It's because we completely relate emotionally to what the people are going through, even though the ritual is absolutely alien. Flowers and incenses instead of a cold room with a coffin and the winter light in an Icelandic setting, you know, but we relate emotionally to what is happening to the people. And that's how a story that is very true to the everyday rituals of its place becomes universal. That is my belief, at least.
And what I understand from your question is you tend to say that it is difficult for us to relate to the local stories as compared to universal stories. You know, if you create a story which is rooted in a place, and if you are not being artificial to it, you're not pretending to tell it, you are a genuine storyteller. If you are a genuine storyteller, and you are even talking about your mother, for example, as I was talking about Seamus Heaney and his poem A Churning Day, you know, this is my belief. You know, before I go on, means, you know, I'm just reminding of Walcott's line. He came to teach in a class, he said, I haven't come to teach, I have come to touch your hearts. That same, I think, when a story comes from your heart, although it is rooted in some physical landscape, it could be Pakistan, India, it could be Caribbean, anywhere. When it is rooted genuinely in a physical place and it comes from the heart, you know, it is bound to touch the heart of everyone. Whether someone is living in Iceland, someone is living in America, wherever someone is living. So, you know, when you write about violated human beings are violated everywhere. When you are writing about dehumanization, genuinely, you know, I do feel that the truth comes from the heart and it goes into your words, you know. Your story begins to breathe with the dehumanization. For example, if I'm writing about the dehumanization, I'm talking about what is happening on the roads in my land, you know, what often police does to the innocent drug addicts, or what happens to the ordinary entertainers, you know, but the way they are described, the way I represent their suffering, I think you are able to relate to that also. So once physical story is physical, and doesn't matter whatever the locale the story has, I think it has a universal appeal, and you can relate to it. It doesn't matter whether the story claims to be universal or the story claims to be physical. It is human heart which is universal, you know. It is the human emotion which is universal. And I think wherever the human emotion is and wherever the human beings are, I think they're able to connect to that. I think that is how I feel.
I remember Rumi, the great mystic poet, he gave an example of compass. How do you say this?
Compass?
Compass.
You said it.
He says, human, we must be like a compass, having a certain connection with the earth, and then through that you can turn 360 degrees around you. And whirling dervish, you know, the dance of them. Once, friend of mine, she is a Sufi dancer. She does this dance. I was writing an essay about her dance, and I interview her, and I ask, I said, don't you feel dizzy when you turn around you? She said at the beginning, yes, but until the certain time, it's like that. But then, after a certain time, when you turn around you, focusing on this turning, you are stable, world is turning. It's like You are not turning. World is turning. You are stable. Talking about this local and universal subject or image, we need a local place, which I call the position. Your position with your personality, with your life, with the coordinates you have, you create this. And you need this certain point to stand. And through that, you had all this journey. And Goethe says, if you want to reach to the heart, speak from your heart. If you are speaking from a very strong position with your heart, you can reach to the others. That's we called universal. I think local is at the same time universal. Universal also has the local in it. It's same. Thank you.
Yeah, I think geography and culture is what makes up place. And although perhaps a story could find the same geography elsewhere, it's the culture that informs the characters that you can't separate from the story, from the characters. Yeah, so quite simply, I think it would be very hard to move a story out of the place that it was created. Although you do see it done with adaptations of, from books to films that are moved, often moved to be set in the States, that, often Hollywood moves, books written outside of the States to be set in the States. So it's obviously done. Whether it's successfully done or not is another question, but it can be done.
Did you start? Have you answered?
I was just thinking about how Dennis Lehane has said that if your process works for you, then it's a good process. And I think in one way or another, we all share the same sorts of approaches to writing. I'm struck by everything each has said, especially about writing being so physical and visceral. I don't know about the rest of you, but I try to set a little alarm so I move around every hour or two, and I don't hear it. And all of a sudden, it's 5 hours later, and often writing is a lot of just staring. There's no real writing going on, the process going on, but so then you have it move for 5 hours. And then you have to kind of begin to move again, and your back hurts and your neck hurts. But all of these things that we're all saying all seem to be connected in ways that allow us to both be where we need to be and to be somewhere else in order to gain the perspective that we need. And I don't doubt that every single one of us gets up feeling like we have just lived multiple lives in 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and yet still our own lives. So I just, I wish I was out there with you so I could see everybody else answering these questions, because I'm going to take them home with me.
Well, that's our time. Thank you guys. Let's thank them.